Music free, but not free after emancipation. With the Civil War ending in 1865, slavery was abolished officially across the United States. Yet in Alabama, for those once enslaved, freedom was never simple. New ways to keep black people under control were created by plantation owners, politicians, and sheriffs. Cotton fields, iron furnaces, and coal mines still dictated life in places like Shelby County and Jefferson County, and all of them demanded cheap labor. Technically free, freed men and women remained trapped by poverty and racial violence. Steady work was hard to find because white employers refused to hire them fairly, while the constant threat of arrest loomed for others without papers proving employment. Families were terrorized by white vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan, with homes and churches burned. By the late 1800s, thousands of black families in Alabama understood that freedom meant survival, not prosperity. As sharecroppers, they worked small plots of land, always falling deeper into debt to white landlords. The old chains of slavery were replaced by new chains of law, debt, and fear. For men like Cottenham, born into this world, freedom was never truly guaranteed. It was fragile, conditional, and always one step away from being stolen again. The rise of vagrancy laws. In the years following emancipation, Alabama passed laws that criminalized the very act of being poor and black. These were called vagrancy laws. A man walking a road without proof of employment could be arrested on the spot. If someone rested by a train depot or looked idle in a sheriff's eyes, that was enough for jail. By 1900, these laws had become one of the most powerful tools for enslaving African Americans. They gave sheriffs and judges the authority to arrest nearly anyone at will. The courts were quick and merciless. Hearings sometimes lasted mere minutes. Once convicted, the man was fined money he could not pay, and that debt turned into labor. Prisoners were leased by county governments to companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad, later bought by U.S. Steel. Strong young men were received by these corporations for their mines and furnaces, while the state collected revenue. For the black community, this system meant every street corner, every courthouse, and every police officer was a potential trap. It was not justice. It was a business, and it turned ordinary survival, simply walking to town or looking for work, into a deadly risk. Cottenham's arrest in 1908 was no accident of law. It was the deliberate result of a system designed to keep black men in chains long after slavery was declared over. Industrial demand for cheap labor. By the dawn of the 20th century, Alabama had become one of the industrial centers of the South. Cities like Birmingham and Bessemer boomed with ironworks, railroads, and coal mines. But behind the rising smokestacks was a hunger for labor that was strong, cheap, and replaceable. Corporations like the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, and later U.S. Steel, were expanding their operations at a speed never seen before. To fuel the blast furnaces and dig coal from the mines, they needed thousands of workers willing to endure danger for almost nothing. Yet white workers often resisted such conditions, joining unions or demanding better pay. The solution for the companies and the state was to turn to convict leasing. Under this arrangement, black men arrested under vagrancy or petty charges were supplied by county jails to corporations. These men were leased for months or even years, forced to labor under armed guards without wages and with no way to buy their freedom. For the corporations, the cost was minimal. For Alabama, the revenue kept county budgets alive. But for the men inside the mines, it was slavery reborn. The system made human life expendable. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, another could be taken from the county jail within days. The industrial rise of Alabama was built on the broken bodies of black laborers who had no voice, no rights, and no chance to escape. Cottenham's early life. Cottenham was born in Shelby County, Alabama in 1883, nearly 2 decades after the Civil War. He was the son and grandson of people who had lived through slavery. Yet his own childhood carried many of the same burdens. His family lived in the rural countryside where cotton fields stretched for miles and opportunities for black families were almost non-existent. As sharecroppers or tenant farmers, most African Americans in Shelby County worked, tied to white landlords through debts that grew each year. Green's parents likely struggled to keep food on the table, relying on small gardens, livestock, and church communities for survival. Education was scarce. Black schools in rural Alabama were underfunded, often just wooden shacks with a single teacher for dozens of children. Green grew up in a world where white supremacy was law, enforced by both local authorities and violent groups that targeted black families. By the time he reached adulthood, jobs outside farming were hard to find. Nearby Birmingham's industrial companies offered work, but discrimination meant the most dangerous and lowest-paying positions were given to black men. Green's daily reality was one of constant insecurity. Never certain if he could earn enough to survive, always aware that a simple accusation could put him in jail. He was a young man living in the shadow of slavery, in a state where freedom was fragile and conditional. By 1908, when he was only 22 years old, his fate would be sealed not by crime, but by the system waiting to trap him. Arrest without crime. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. In March of 1908, Cottenham's life changed forever. He was 22 years old, standing on a street in Columbiana, the county seat of Shelby County. To the local sheriff, that was enough to mark him as suspicious. The charge was vagrancy, a vague accusation applicable to nearly any black man not actively working under the watch of white employers. Proof of theft, violence, or wrongdoing was not required for vagrancy. It simply meant the authorities could say a man had no visible means of support. For African Americans in Alabama, this was a trap waiting at every corner. Arrest could be invited by walking to a train station, visiting relatives, or even pausing on the roadside. When Green was taken into custody, the decision was not about justice. It was about profit. Sheriffs and county officials knew that each black body arrested meant income through Convict Leasing. Within days, he was brought before a local judge. The trial was swift and almost meaningless, lasting only a few minutes. He had no lawyer, no chance to defend himself, and no money to pay the fine imposed by the court. In that moment, Cottenham became property once again, not owned by a plantation master, but by the state and the corporations that relied on forced labor. His arrest was not an accident of circumstance. It was the outcome of a system carefully built to re-enslave freed men in Alabama, more than 4 decades after slavery was abolished. Conviction and leasing. After the trial, the machinery of neo-slavery moved quickly. Cottenham's conviction for vagrancy was enough to hand him over to the county. But Shelby County had no interest in keeping him locked in a local jail. Instead, they saw an opportunity to make money. Under the convict leasing system, counties rented prisoners to private companies that paid for their labor. In this case, Green was leased to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a massive industrial operation bought by U.S. Steel in 1907. For the company, the arrival of Green and dozens of other prisoners meant a steady supply of strong young men to dig coal deep beneath the earth. For the county, it meant cash that helped fund local budgets. But for Green, it meant chains, brutality, and a return to slavery under another name. Convict laborers were transported in groups, shackled together, guarded by men with rifles. Once at the mines, Their identities were stripped from them, and they were given numbers instead of names. They were not considered employees. They were assets, leased and discarded when broken. On paper, Green's sentence might have been only a few months, but in practice, sentences stretched endlessly. If a man collapsed from exhaustion or was accused of disobedience, new charges were added, keeping him enslaved indefinitely. The system offered no escape and no appeal. Cottenham's fate was sealed the moment he was leased to U.S. Steel. He had entered a world where survival was uncertain, and death was often the only release. Life inside the coal mines. When Cottenham arrived at the coal mines of U.S. Steel in Alabama, he entered one of the harshest environments imaginable. These mines, located in places like Pratt City and Ensley near Birmingham, were dark, narrow, and suffocating. Shifts that stretched 10 to 12 hours, often longer, were worked by the prisoners. The air underground was thick with coal dust, which filled their lungs and caused chronic coughing. Cave-ins were a constant threat in the unstable tunnels. By the dim light of oil lamps, the men dug with picks and shovels, sweating in the heat and choking in the dust. Meager food, mostly cornbread, fatback, and beans, was never enough to replace the calories burned during brutal labor. Water was dirty, sometimes carried in buckets from nearby streams. Sleep came on wooden planks or bare ground, often in crowded barracks near the mines, where men were chained together at night. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and infections from untreated wounds were common. Unlike free workers, the convict laborers had no voice, no union, no way to protest their suffering. If a man fell ill or collapsed from exhaustion, guards forced him back to work or replaced him with another prisoner. To the company, these men were not people, they were tools. Cottenham, like hundreds of others, faced each day with the knowledge that his life could end in a collapsed tunnel or from sickness, and the world outside would never know his name. Punishment and surveillance. The mines were not just places of labor. They were prisons enforced by violence. Whips, shotguns, and pistols were carried by guards. Immediate punishment could be brought by any sign of resistance, working too slowly, pausing to rest, or even looking a guard in the eye. Frequent and brutal whippings left deep scars across backs and shoulders. Men were chained in leg irons while they worked, forced to drag the weight of iron cuffs through mud and coal dust. At night, prisoners were locked into stockades surrounded by barbed wire, with armed guards patrolling to prevent escape. The system was designed to crush both the body and the spirit. A man's sentence could be extended indefinitely by even minor infractions. If a prisoner was accused of insubordination or laziness, new charges were added, making freedom impossible. Families on the outside often never heard from their loved ones again. Cottenham lived under constant surveillance, with no privacy, no rest, and no hope. Every moment was controlled. When he ate, when he slept, how he worked, and how he was punished. The guard's authority was absolute, and cruelty was encouraged to keep men in line. In this world, fear was the most powerful weapon. Not just under the weight of coal, but under the crushing knowledge they were trapped in a system designed to erase their humanity. Green and the others labored. Punishment was not the exception. It was the rule. It ensured obedience, but it also ensured despair. Cottenham's death in captivity. By the spring of 1908, Cottenham had been in the coal mines only a few months, but the brutal conditions had already broken his body. Day after day he labored in suffocating tunnels, breathing coal dust that scarred his lungs and surviving on meager rations that left him weak and malnourished. Their toll was taken quickly by the physical punishment and endless exhaustion. Records show many prisoners lasted only weeks before falling ill. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and infections spread unchecked in the filthy barracks where men were chained together at night. Medical care was non-existent. A prisoner who could not work was often left to die. For Green, the collapse came swiftly. At just 22 years old, his health deteriorated beyond recovery. Guards and supervisors did not see him as a man to be saved, but as a tool that had worn out. In the spring of that year, he died inside the Pratt Mines camp near Birmingham. Disease was listed as the cause on his death certificate, but the true cause was the system itself, a machine built to extract every ounce of labor until the body gave out. Like so many others, Green was buried in an unmarked grave, his story nearly erased. His body was likely never seen by his family, answers never received, and closure never found. For them, silence replaced justice. For Green, death was the final escape from a slavery that should never have existed. Legacy of neo-slavery. The story of Green Cottenham is not just about one man's suffering. It is about a system that defined life in Alabama and across the South for decades after the Civil War. Convict leasing turned freedom into a fragile illusion. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of black men were trapped, arrested on false charges, and forced into mines, lumber camps, and farms. The wealth of powerful corporations like U.S. Steel was built by their labor, and leasing revenues kept local governments alive. Written into the history of Alabama is the legacy of this system. The rise of Birmingham as an industrial city was made possible by the blood and suffering of men like Green. The so-called New South prided itself on progress and industry. But that progress was chained to the bodies of black prisoners. For the African American community, the trauma lingered for generations. Families were broken, names forgotten, and justice denied. Even after convict leasing officially ended in Alabama in 1928, other forms of forced labor and racial injustice took its place. Green Cottenham's death in 1908 was not the end of slavery's story. It was proof that slavery had been reborn in another form, a symbol of countless others whose lives were consumed by greed and racism is his unmarked grave. Remembering his story is essential, because it forces us to see how freedom was stolen again and again long after emancipation was declared. It is a reminder that history's chains were never easily broken,